So good morning, everyone that is here. Thank you for coming. Today we are going to go pretty in depth into what informed consent is, what the process looks like, and in the ever present, it depends nature of research. There are different situations and paperwork that could occur based on the choices going into your protocol. And then we will also go in depth into what conflicts of interest looks like on the IRB side. If you want to get into what that looks like more, we have presented on non-university activities, and that is a much more in-depth look at conflicts of interest. This is specifically looking at it from an IRB vantage. Buttons to work. So, like I said, it is pretty in depth. So, there are different slides with different pieces. If you go back into the slide later, everything is hyperlinked. So, you don't have to try to find it in the slides, but you can go specifically to the information you need. I also have several pieces of documentation that you may need, and all of those can be found on our IRB forms and resources page, which is also linked on this table of contents and can be found following those breadcrumbs on our website. So to start, the process comes from us because of different federal requirements. So the US Department of Human Services says that the process involves three key features. The first being disclosing information to the potential subjects so that they can make an informed decision, making sure that they understand, not using language that kind of buries what you're actually asking of them, and then ensure that the process is voluntary and that, again, there's no deception happening unless it's required for your research. So this should be legally effective and obtained before the actual research portion takes place, so prospectively obtained. So with that voluntary nature, you want to make sure you're minimizing any sort of coercion, undue influence, or anything that could impact the voluntariness of informed consent. So we want to make sure no one feels pressured to participate, that any procedures that might be perceived as coercion are minimized. So in our instance, it's a lot of faculty who may be collecting data from students or potential students. So ways to minimize that could be collecting data anonymously, having a different partner in the research team collect the data if they do not have that relationship with students, and potentially withholding the identity key. You can make it a non-mandatory assignment. And in those cases, having an alternative if you are assigning points to it so that students do not feel that their grade will be impacted if they don't participate. And questions should be able to be skipped without any sort of repercussions. Other situations that could be coercion are compensation. If it does not match what you are asking participants to do, then that could be seen as coercion. If you are recruiting people who maybe really need $200 and you're doing that for a simple survey, that is going to influence them to answer something they may not answer otherwise. And then sometimes power dynamics or even friendly relationships could come into play and impact the accuracy of responses because they do feel that they need to please their friend or their mentor or their supervisor. So making sure we're finding ways to reduce that is important to the informed consent process. So the basic tenets of informed consent are treating people with respect and that they can make their own choices. People expect that they can make decisions about what information they do and do not share and about what you as a researcher will share with others. They may disclose it to a researcher, but they don't want it out in the public. So, to make sure we're doing things ethically, we need to make sure we're communicating what we're doing during the consent process, documenting that it occurred in case of audits or just double checking, and maintaining that record when possible. So, these are the way to do that is using informed consent forms, and it'll have key information. And when it is signed, that serves as the record or documentation. So there are some federal elements that have to be included. These are called the basic elements of informed consent. And if you want to get into all the legal jargon with it, that is called common rule under 45 CFR Federal Regulation 46. So this is the exact language, so it does kind of get into it. But these are things that should be provided to subjects, or if needed, their legally authorized representative, which throughout this I may refer to as an LAR. But the first is you have to let them know that the study is research. They need to understand why it's being conducted, how long they're expected to participate, and what they're being expected to do. If what they are doing is experimental, they need to be aware that it is experimental. It hasn't necessarily been tested or validated yet. There needs to be a description of any reasonable risks or discomforts they may experience. They should know if there are any benefits directly to themselves or indirectly to the literature, to society in the future. And if it is a situation where there are alternative processes or procedures, they need to know that maybe there's something else they should be seeking, especially in, the health field. If there's an alternative that might be better for them instead of experimental, they should know that and not feel like the only option is your research. If they are having information maintained, they need to know how you are keeping things confidential and the extent that it will be maintained. With that, UIS IRB policy does require that records are maintained at least 3 years after completion of the study, and that should be in your informed consent form. The only exception for that is if it is sponsored research and the sponsor requires it to be deleted earlier than that 3 years or maintained longer. If the research involves more than minimal risk, then the participants need to know if any compensation is involved and if there are medical treatments available if injury occurs, if those are available, what they consist of, or where they can find further information. If anything were to go wrong, or if things are unclear, or there's an injury, hopefully that does not occur, but just in case, they do need to have contact information for all of those. And later I'll go into some preferred language we have at the university for those contacts. There are 9 basic elements, so we're almost there. They need to know that it's voluntary. They do not have to participate. They can refuse at any time with no penalty, with no loss of benefits. And if they start and they've consented, they can still stop. They can discontinue at any time without penalty or loss of benefits. And then last only applies if you are collecting identifiable private information or biospecimens. One of these 2 statements do have to be in the informed consent form. The first is if you plan to keep their data, de-identify it, and either use it for your own future study or give to another investigator in the future. If this language is not there and you move to another university, you can't use that data. UIS is technically the owner of that data. You cannot give it to someone else, even if it's de-identified, if they do not consent to having that information shared. However, if you want to be more conservative, you can use the statement that it will not be used or distributed for future research studies. And that is even for your own. The approval, the consent is only for that specific protocol. So, after the basics, there are potential additional elements that might need to be added based on what your research entails. So, again, this should be provided only if it applies. So if there are risks to the subject that might be unforeseeable, if there are side effects based on what you are doing. Obviously, this is not common if it's a survey, but if you were doing some sort of clinical trial, there are potential risks that you just cannot predict. If you, as the investigator, need to terminate participation without consent, that should be included in the form. If you are doing some sort of health survey and heart rate hits a certain level, they need to know at what point it's done. You cannot participate anymore. If there's a certain reaction, they need to know that you will terminate it even if they want to go forward. If there are any additional costs, if they are expected to travel across the state to you, if they have to purchase something in order to participate, they need to know that in advance of agreeing to be in the study. If there are consequences of withdrawing, then they need to know what that is. If they are being given an experimental drug and they stop, there might be withdrawal symptoms. So they need to know what that termination looks like and how to make sure it's followed in an orderly fashion. If significant new findings are developed during the course of the research that might impact their willingness to continue, they need to know. If 3 subjects have a really poor reaction, and that might happen to other people, they need to know that that's a possibility and they can terminate if that were to occur. In some cases, they need to know the approximate number of subjects, especially if there is a control group and they need to know the likelihood of being added to the control versus receiving the intervention. If you are going to sell their information, even if it's removed, they need to know if you're getting money and if they get a cut of that, that should be included. If clinically relevant research results occur, maybe they want to see those results. They need to know how it will be disclosed and under what conditions. And if you are using research with biospecimens and you are doing anything with genome sequencing, that should be disclosed. All right, so I will pause for a second. Are there any questions regarding basic or additional elements before I get into the UIS resources? Good for now. All right. So because we don't expect you to memorize these laws or memorize these elements, we do have a checklist available to investigators, again, on that resource page linked in the table of contents. So first we have a checklist. Most of the checklist is directly taken from the CFR, but it does include additional language that can assist you as you go and breaks it into individual pieces. The first page and a third includes the basic elements. The UIS additional requirements are on page 2, which include how the contact information should be broken down. So we do want contact information for the investigator because they can answer questions on the technical side. If there are concerns that they want to address, not with the researcher, that they want to be held confidential, the university does have an ethics line. That is typically what we encourage. But if there is someone else available for research-related injuries, concerns, or complaints, that should be included. And then it should also identify that this has been reviewed and approved by the UIS IRB, and then it includes contact information for our chair, Dr. Vasquez, and includes her phone number if they want to discuss that. In most cases, we do require a signature block that shows that they consent, they agree, they understand that obviously they're not going to remember every single detail, they're not going to memorize a phone number. They should be able to get a copy. And if it is online, they should be able to print the copy. We really want it to be legally effective, so they need to show that they are of the age of majority. In the United States, that is typically 18, and they should add a line next to that statement. And then if you are audio recording, video recording, photographing, that should have an additional section to initial next to, just so it's not buried in the consent and catches anyone off guard. Past those sections, there are those additional elements, those 9 different things. And then if there is international research, there are, I'm going to say 2, but it really is more than 2 elements that need to be considered. That will lead you to a separate checklist, and that checklist will be covered at the November 1st workshop because that also is a much bigger topic than I think we could cover in this hour. It gets its own separate workshop. And then because you probably don't want to create this from scratch, we do have a template This is a general template. It works for most situations. If you get into the clinical trial space, it doesn't necessarily include everything. So again, this is basic general template. But you fill in the sections you need and edit choices to meet your protocol. It does start looking a little daunting. It is 11 pages, but it has sections of guide text, it has choices. So you delete the guide text and the irrelevant choices as you go. And typically it'll reduce to about a 2 or 3 page informed consent document. And because I don't want to show you the entire 11 pages, this is what the first page kind of looks like. It gives an invitation and you enter eligibility criteria. So that will expand a little bit. You will give a basic summary. If that is not necessarily relevant, this section could be deleted, which would shorten it or elongate it depending on what you add or subtract from it. Let me go back. There are some instances where consent may need to be a little different or taken away entirely. In those cases, we might need to waive certain parts of your consent process. The first is a waiver of documentation. This specifically refers to this signature or keeping a copy of the document. Every other basic element is included. Every additional element that is required is there, either provided verbally or in writing, or just getting rid of the signature. So this is allowed via our federal regulation. It is permissible if some or all subjects will take away the signature if one of these apply in its entirety. So option one is in situations where the signature will link the subject to the study, and that puts them at risk of harm if their information is put out there, if there's a breach to confidentiality. If that is a potential, the subjects are given the choice. Do they want to sign it or do they want to just leave it blank? And then whichever they choose governs. The second choice is probably the most common that I've seen are in situations with no more than minimal risk of harm and the procedures in any other situation besides research, it doesn't need a signature. And I'll go into examples of that since it is the most common. And the third is if you are doing research with members of a cultural or community group where signing forms is not their norm, but it does still have to be no more than minimal risk of harm, and some sort of alternative mechanism does need to be presented for documenting that it took place. So these situations might be if you are asking questions about illegal activity, if their name is released, that could put them at legal risk. If it is situations of domestic abuse and their partner or family member finds out that they participated, that could put them at a higher level of risk. So we would waive the signature so there's no connection between their answers and the research. Like I said, the most common we see are with online surveys. It's not necessarily feasible to go out and get an actual signature from every single person who answers your questions, especially if it's an anonymous online survey. So when you call someone, you're not asking them for consent for a phone call. So this is only asking for a signature in the research contexts. So that requirement can be waived in most situations. And then the last one was the kind of self-explanatory one where it's not the cultural or community norm. When it is waived, then we still require some sort of informed consent process. We're just getting rid of that signature. So again, all of those elements are provided, an information sheet is provided or given orally to the participants. So this looks very similar to another waiver. So make sure you're choosing the one that says documentation if it's just the signature. And you only have to justify one of those three situations. So the first, again, is that link to the research. You would explain why that would be a risk of harm. If it's two, you would explain why it's no more than a minimal risk and why that is not normally considered to need a signature outside of the research context. And three, you would need to explain why that is not the cultural or community norm and that it's no more than minimal risk, and that there is an alternative mechanism if you're doing it orally or otherwise. Like I said, very similar sounding is the waiver or alteration of consent. This is getting rid of actual elements or changing them. So this is getting rid of things beyond just a signature. So it has different federal criteria, it's a very different request, even though it sounds very similar. So these all have to apply. Instead of 1 out of 3, all of these must be present. So the first is that it cannot be more than minimal risk. You have to prove that it could not practicably be carried out without this waiver. So this does not mean that it's time consuming, not inconvenient, not expensive. It means you cannot do the research without that waiver, or you can't properly do the research without the waiver. If you are collecting identifiable private information or biospecimens, you also need to show or demonstrate or justify that you can't do it in any other format. You have to collect it in an identifiable way. If there's a way to do it without collecting that, the IRB will request you do that to reduce the potential risk that happens. And even if you're waiving or changing some of the language, it still cannot adversely affect the rights and welfare of the subjects. You can't, put them at a higher risk. You cannot jeopardize their trust or trick them into participating. And then when appropriate, you may have to provide the subject or their representative with the information after participation if it does not put them at risk or jeopardize the data. So some of these instances are methodologies that involve deception. If giving full information at the beginning will impact your data. Again, if you are collecting data that is a natural behavioral response, if you give them consent before, that could interfere with the natural response. So you would want to waive that, but tell them after. If you are doing secondary data where there was a retrospective cohort, meaning it's been done in the past, that might require some sort of waiver. If they're in a state of mind where they cannot give consent, then that might be an instance where a waiver is given. It's situation by situation, but if the representative is unavailable, that might be a case the IRB has to consider. If you are doing secondary analysis of data that is non-public, but it is still identifiable, it may not be practical to contact 10,000 people who have given their data to someone else, and it's already been consented to by someone else. So that might be a waiver. When it is approved, it still can't violate the rights or welfare. They can't be tricked into participating, especially if it is research they might have found objectionable if they had been fully informed. And then they should also be allowed to withdraw if they do dissent. Again, it looks very similar to the last one, but make sure it says waiver or alteration. And you have to include answers to each of the 5 questions, not just picking one of the 3. But it's the same language that was in the federal regulation. If deception is necessary to your research, then a debriefing protocol is also necessary to the extent that the IRB will ask for that protocol. There's not a specific template. It's just kind of explaining your process so that we know what information is being given, what's withheld, and why it's withheld. If that gives additional risk, you would just provide rationale for why that step is not appropriate. Kind of give another pause if there's any questions at that point. Like I said, this is a very in-depth description of things. None so far? All right. In some situations, assent should be collected instead of consent. I'm so sorry. Yes.
I want to understand what do you mean by methodology that may involve deception?
Deception. So if you are researching something that requires you to kind of lie to your subjects, that is deception. So, what are some common ones I've seen? If you are doing political research and you say you're just asking for their views, but really you're changing some of the language to see if you can kind of get them to answer one way or another, you're testing something, but they don't know what you're actually testing. So to get the correct results, you might need to kind of lie a little bit, but at the end, they do need to be told what the truth is so that they're not tricking them into talking about something they might not have been comfortable talking about otherwise. Did I answer that? It's not super common, but it does occur, and sometimes it could affect the integrity of your data. So assent is for people, typically children, who are not legally able to consent. So they will need to agree in the affirmative that they will participate. You can't just force a kid to, answer your questions just because they're not legally old enough to sign consent. You also should not take silence or a lack of dissent as an affirmative response. And young children can show signs of distress that should also be taken as dissent or, yeah, dissent. So while there are no federal regulations about the elements of assent, as a researcher, you probably have that background, and the IRB will also consider the age, the maturity level, the development of the children being researched. So adolescents who understand at approximately the same level as an adult, they might have what looks like a consent form. They just cannot legally consent, so that is considered assent. If you are studying children with a limited ability to comprehend, you should consider the degree that they are capable of understanding and change the language to fit that. If you are researching multiple age groups, you might have one for younger children, one for preteens, and one for adolescents. So they would be slightly different language. The UIS general rule of thumb is that children under the age of 8 can assent orally, they can nod, they can give a thumbs up, called passive assent. And children older or 8 or older can sign their assent. It is just not legally effective consent. So it is assent. In these instances, you will also need to collect parental permission. So in addition to the child agreeing, a legal representative, a parent or a guardian, should give permission for their child or ward to participate. Typically, this is going to look exactly like an informed consent, except they are signing for the child, not for themselves. If the child does dissent, parental permission cannot override it unless it's for the health and safety of the child. Go back to that for a second. So, depending on the risk versus the benefit of the protocol, there might be different levels of permission required. And typically, this is just one parent or both parents when possible. So, if it is no more than minimal risk, usually only one parent needs to sign. If it is above minimal risk, but there is a direct benefit to the child, again, typically only one parent would need to sign that permission. If there is greater than minimal risk and the child does not directly benefit, but it should yield generalizable knowledge to potential future subjects about a disorder or condition, both parents should be signing that unless one parent is deceased, not known, incompetent, not available, or if only one parent has sole custody and legal responsibility. And then if it is research that is high risk, there is not a lot of opportunity. It can still be approved by the institutional research board, but again, it does have to be both parents when possible. Similar to parental assent is use of proxy, but this is for adults. There are instances where adult subjects cannot give consent, and proxies are legally authorized individuals who can act on that adult's behalf. Currently, we live in Illinois. assume most of us live in Illinois, so we do have to follow Illinois law. So when the research takes place outside of Illinois, or especially outside of the United States, the IRB has to be given a copy of either the applicable law that governs or a statement from an attorney in that jurisdiction that shows that the proxy is legally authorized to consent. So that is the end of the informed consent side. How we doing in the audience? Feeling okay for now? All right. The conflicts of interest section of the IRB application is much smaller. It could get more complex depending on what you're actually involved with. Again, it's just 3 questions. And it's, do you have a financial interest or fiduciary legal relationship with the research sponsor? If it's not sponsored research, it doesn't apply. If you have that sort of interest or relationship related to the research, that might apply. Some instances are owning a startup company, or if you develop intellectual property, it might be useful to your company. That mutually beneficial relationship could cross a line if it's not managed. And in some instances, when there are members of the same family on the research team, that could be something to be considered. And this does apply to the investigator and members of their immediate family. So that is something to take into account. So if you are in a position of influence to kind of influence university business, research, or other decisions that lead to gain for you or your family or a company that you are involved with, that could negatively impact the university's mission or its integrity. That is something that should be managed. Again, it's not necessarily going to get things rejected, but those mechanisms do need to be in place so that things are done ethically. You're not abusing either of your positions and not taking advantage of things that you would not have access to otherwise. So if it is with a sponsor, this might be if you are being paid by the sponsor, if you are a consultant, if you have a large set of stock in that sponsor, that could be considered a financial interest. My examples are actually that. If you have equity in the company or if you are acting as a consultant, those are 2 examples. A fiduciary relationship is a legal interest to act on in the interest of the entity or another individual. So if you serve on the board of directors for the sponsor, if you are on an advisory group for the sponsor, that kind of blurs a line between what is acceptable because you're using your influence in your fiduciary role to impact your research at the university. If it is specifically related to the research, not necessarily with the sponsor of the research, your spouse, your partner might own a company that provides services, and you doing good research could make them money. That does kind of blur a line between the university and that company. And maybe if you are the vice president of a committee that has similar interests to what the research pertains to, that might encourage you to fudge some details or some data. Not saying you will, but there is the chance, the potential to be seen that you are doing that. So that's what the fiduciary relationship could be. And then probably the more common one we see is that family members are doing research together at UIS. This is not necessarily a problem. It's just if you are in a position to gain them access to something they might not otherwise have had access to, it might look like favoritism. That could be to the detriment of the university's integrity or mission. So this is typically not an issue for the IRB unless there's a supervisory or mentorship relationship, or if the sponsor, if it is sponsored research, requires a disclosure during the informed consent process or during publication. So typically, if this is the case, you've already done your RNUA, you've disclosed it, there's a plan already in place. We would just want to see a copy of that. If it's not in place, there are resources to develop that. So those are called conflict of interest management plans. Again, we have those linked on our resource pages on the table of contents. And it's a written understanding that the situation exists. It existing is not a problem. It could be perceived as a problem, so there are mechanisms that might mitigate that or completely eliminate the conflict. So it needs to be created, implemented, and monitored. And that is between the investigator, their chair or head, and the dean, some sort of oversight committee, any sort of staff that it might apply to, and then our office will also kind of help with that process since we are also kind of the conflict of interest office, separate from the IRB. So the first step is meeting with your director, your chair, whoever your unit head is, you will meet with them and likely a representative from our office. And you will download the most up-to-date U of I system conflict of interest conflict management plan and edit to address whatever the situation is. This is typically financial and fiduciary, not necessarily the familial conflict of interest. So this is, again, one of those big documents that could change based on situations, and there are 6 sections and multiple approvals needed just to make sure that there is nothing untoward happening. So it is separating your university responsibilities and your responsibilities to your other interest. So it's just filling out these highlighted sections. The purpose is to address the conflict of interest that could potentially arise. So the first section is managing it. The second section is managing it concerning involvement of other university individuals. Sometimes it doesn't apply, sometimes it does. Section 3 is the relationship between the company and the faculty member or the academic staff or whoever is involved. Section 4 is managing it concerning university resources and intellectual property. Without permissions in place, you should not be using university resources for a non-university position, but there are instances where agreements can be signed, permissions can be given. It's just making sure all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. There is a review cycle, so it should be monitored every once in a while. And that is more than just one person who needs to kind of oversee it, having multiple perspectives in place. And then any sort of attachments should be included. And there's just an acknowledgement of the agreement. The investigator will sign, the management oversight committee will sign, the director, the dean, our office, someone will sign just to make sure that everything is in place. The professor, any sort of directors. In instances where you are collaborating with family members, typically a letter from the unit head showing that it's being managed is sufficient. And we do have a template that I made sure to link on the website last night. So it may not be available yet, but it is in the process of being approved by web services. But this letter, once you have access to it, can be tailored to fit the needs. So if there is a supervisory relationship, it's just showing either spouse or sibling or parent child can report to the other. There should be no approval of traveling or reimbursements between those. It should be handled by someone else in the department. They should not be overseeing time or effort reporting just because there's that relationship that could be motivation to not necessarily follow all the rules. It's just putting plans into place so that things are followed the way they should be. So after that is drafted, the unit executive officer will appoint that conflict oversight committee. It's typically 3 peers that will review it and provide feedback before actually getting those signatures. And once all plans are addressed, all feedback is addressed, the plan will be circulated for signatures and approval, and then get signed. And then it is included with the IRB protocol application. It also will likely need to be uploaded to your RNUA. Okay. And our contact, you can get in touch with pretty much anybody in our office at the ORA email. Our main UIS website is uis.edu/research, and there are different tabs within that. To get to the forms and resources, go to the IRB section, you click on the forms and resources, and it will get you to lots and lots of documents that you may or may not need. Get the final chance for questions.
Is it okay to ask verbally?
Yeah, you can ask verbally or in the chat, either or.
So this will be easier, I think, talking rather than typing. So the American Cancer Society's CPS 2 and 3 programs, the way they do collaboration is they ask for an abstract first. If they approve the abstract, they will then ask for a full research proposal before they agree to share the data and agree to the collaboration. At what point during this process would I need to receive IRB approval, as it would be working with data of people who had already signed consent forms with the American Cancer Society?
Would we, I might defer that one to Lucia. Would we ask for that before they submit the protocol or at the same time?
We can do it at the same time.
So they can get approval
Yeah. at
from the
same
Cancer
time,
Society.
So they can start developing their application while they're waiting to get access to the data.
Yeah, so they could be done simultaneously. It just, we
I
couldn't
would just
probably
need the,
approve it until that agreement is in place.
okay, so effectively I would need to get the finalized approval from IRB between the full proposal acceptance from the ACS and actually starting the research.
Yes, so you can initiate that proposal with the IRB at any point, but yeah, it wouldn't be necessarily approved until it's finalized on the other end.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. If there aren't any others at this moment, again, our email is always open. We respond as quickly as we can, depending on the workload of different members of the staff. And then our website does have a lot of resources. Sometimes if you don't know what you're looking for, it is a lot to wade through. So if an email is going to take too long, pick up the phone and call somebody in the office, and we will try to get you an answer as fast as we can. And the question always pops up, will this be online? Yes, it will be. After these meetings, I go back to my office, and if I don't have a meeting, I do edit it and try to get it on YouTube pretty quickly, probably maybe an hour or two if it's a good day. By the end of the day, if it's not. Nothing else. Yeah, they're free to go.